afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse webinar, jointly sponsored with the National Poverty Center at the University of Michigan. We're very excited that you could join us. I'm going to give you a brief introduction and turn it over to the panelists. The Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse is a virtual library of over 2,500 vetted research articles and other research-based publications designed for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to facilitate an exchange of information and dissemination of high-quality research on self-sufficiency and related topics. We are an online community including several interactive features, many of which are currently in development, and include things like a What's New feature, and an area with which you can make a linkage to your peers. We also sponsor several webinars on areas of topical interest, as well as an Emerging Scholars feature via our website. On the screen now are the 12 topical areas that we organize our materials into, and what's critically important about these topical areas is that all of our materials are grounded in these topics as they relate to the field of self-sufficiency. So within SSRC, if you were, for example, to search in childcare, you would not find a great deal of information about just availability or access to childcare. Rather, you would find research around how childcare supports the self-sufficiency of low-income and at-risk families. We are excited today that this webinar is co-hosted with the National Poverty Center and facilitated by Dr. Luke Schaefer, who is an assistant professor of social work at the University of Michigan and a research affiliate at the National Poverty Center. And with that, I will turn it over to Luke.
It's really a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to get to partner with the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. This is my second webinar with them, and I have enjoyed both experiences a great deal. As Courtney said, I'm from the University of Michigan and the National Poverty Center, in School of Social Work in the National Poverty Center, and I'm particularly happy to be talking with you today about what I think is a very important topic, making unemployment insurance work better for low-income working families. So unemployment insurance is a major social insurance program protecting workers against involuntary unemployment, yet it hasn't changed that much since it was first established in 1935. In the last decade, we've seen an uptick in research that finds low-earning unemployed workers experience more than average difficulty accessing UI benefits. Yet we know that low-earning workers are subject to UI taxes, even regressively so. Just to take a minute to explain what I mean by that. UI taxes are levied on employers, yet our best research suggests that workers really bear the burden of that tax, meaning it effectively comes out of their paycheck. In most states, UI taxes are levied against a taxable wage base, just like Social Security, except unlike Social Security, that taxable wage base has stayed low over the decades since UI was established. So imagine a state that has a $14,000 taxable wage base, and then imagine a minimum wage worker who makes about $14,000 a year. All of their annual earnings would be subject to the UI tax, yet for a worker making $100,000, only the first $14,000 would be subject to UI taxes. So in addition, though, we know that low-earning unemployed workers have greater trouble accessing UI. Conversely, though, they may have a greater need for income support during spells of unemployment than is true for higher earners. And arguably, UI is more important now that cash assistance is less available following the 1996 welfare reform. This is the only chart I'll show you because I want to make my time brief to get to our excellent presenters. Here we're just tracking the unemployment rate by education level, and that top red bar is the adults with less than a high school degree. That very bottom blue bar, or teal, I guess, is workers with a college degree. I think it's worth noting that at the very end of the booming 1990s and 2000, when our overall unemployment rate was at a historic low, the unemployment rate for those without a high school degree was actually higher than it was for college-educated workers during the very height of unemployment for them during the Great Recession period. And you see that that red line pops well over 14% during the Great Recession era for low-educated workers. So periods of unemployment are a fairly typical part of the experience for low-wage workers. What do we know about why low-earning workers have difficulty accessing UI? Right now, we've identified three factors. The first is they may have trouble meeting monetary eligibility criteria. These are eligibility criteria that are state-based, that are based on a minimum amount of earnings, or in a few cases, hours, over the course of a 4-quarter period. And low-earning workers who get fewer hours on average and have lower wage rates per hour may have difficulty hitting these monetary eligibility thresholds. A second factor is trouble meeting non-monetary eligibility criteria. These are based on the nature of the job separation. Was it a layoff? Was it a voluntary quit? Was there a discharge for cause? And a piece of this is the requirements that are imposed on beneficiaries, things they have to do to remain eligible. And low-earning workers may be more likely to voluntarily quit a job on average, and this may be due to person, but we also have good research suggesting that there's a sectoral component to this. And that means that what I mean by that is that low-earning workers tend to be clustered in sectors that avoid layoffs rather than just fluctuating hours from week to week to control labor costs. And so this makes it more difficult for low-earning workers to become eligible for non-monetary reasons. Finally, we have some evidence over the last couple of years that there may be a failure to apply for benefits even among eligibles. That means that low earning, whether or not you think about it as low educated or disadvantaged workers, even when they're eligible, they may be actually still less likely to access UI than higher educated workers. And the first part of this is that UI is confusing, even to me. I've been studying it for a number of years. But also the social networks of low-earning workers may have limited or in some cases inaccurate information about UI. So what have we done lately? In the ARA, there was $7 billion made available to states to modernize their UI programs. That's $7 billion split across the states. And they had some choices and had to do some things to get their share of the money. For the first third of the UI modernization funds, states had to adopt an alternative base period, an ABP. And this is primarily probably the most prominent reform of UI. We've seen a lot of states over the years implement ABPs. And this reforms monetary eligibility. And Alix Gould-Werth is going to tell you a little bit more about the ABP in the next presentation. And for the remaining two-thirds, states could choose between 4 options, 2 of which targeted non-monetary eligibility. One choice was to make eligible workers seeking part-time hours, while another choice was to ease requirements for workers who leave a job due to family demands. Today we have an excellent lineup of speakers. Alix Gould-Werth from the University of Michigan is going to report on the first national evaluation of the efficacy of the alternative base period, which has now been adopted by over 40 states. Alix Hertel-Fernandez, Alix number 2, from Harvard is going to report on new research about the role of information as a barrier to UI application. And Claire McKenna from the National Employment Law Project, perhaps the most prominent worker and employment law nonprofits focused on unemployment insurance for quite some time now, is going to report on initiatives in various states with a focus on initiatives that relax non-monetary eligibility criteria. If I could wave a magic wand, and I'm going to give you my thoughts, and then we'll see if you think that the research that's presented by our great panelists bears this up. My own research suggests to increase access to unemployment insurance for low-earning workers, We need to reduce non-monetary ineligibility to a few weeks instead of the duration of an unemployment spell. This is something that's commonly done in Western European nations, and it was actually more the norm in the U.S. system a few decades ago. We need to require UI administrators to notify potential eligibles in a carefully constructed way based on research done by Alix and his colleague, Jeff Winger. And then my reading, not so much my research, but the reading of the literature suggests we should end experience rating in UI, which provides adverse incentives for firms to contest UI claims. We should consider federalizing the UI system to ensure better financing across the countercyclical pattern. And we should consider a complete overhaul of the system that might allow workers more flexibility to take benefits when they need them. Obviously, this last bullet has the asterisk of being what could technically be termed pie in the sky. And maybe that's true for all of the final three, but I wanted to put them out there as a starting place for discussion. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alix Gould-Werth.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Alix Gould-Werth, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Michigan. As Luke mentioned, I will be presenting on the alternative base period, and my remarks are based on a paper that Luke and I put together. So as Luke mentioned, there are 3 reasons that low-wage workers might not receive unemployment insurance. And the alternative base period is an intervention that's targeted at workers who don't receive unemployment insurance based on what we call monetary eligibility criteria. So what are these monetary eligibility criteria? These are kind of the criteria that are designed to ensure that a worker has what we call sufficient labor force attachment, so that the worker is really well integrated into the labor force before the worker loses their job. These criteria vary from state to state. It's different in every single state, but in all of the states, how they determine whether or not you are monetarily eligible is they examine your earnings over a 4-quarter period. Most states have an eligibility threshold that requires that you have a certain amount of earnings within that 4-quarter period, although some states look at hours. When examining that 4-quarter period, the states may also require that you have 2 consecutive quarters of earnings or ask you to reach an additional higher threshold within the quarter in which you have the highest wage. These rules are fairly complex, and if you're interested in the criteria in your specific state, there is a URL at the bottom where you can check out the state comparison of UI laws, which I would recommend looking at. So as I mentioned before, when we're determining monetary eligibility, we look at a 4-quarter period. But the question that's maybe more interesting than it seems at first is which 4 quarters of earnings in a worker's work history should we look at? So I think this is best explained using an example. And the example that I'm going to use is a worker who loses her job on Groundhog's Day of this year, so February 2nd. If a worker loses her job on February 2nd and then files for benefits shortly thereafter, it doesn't really make sense for us to examine her wages in the filing quarter. So if the worker loses her job on February 2nd, we're going to miss all of the wages that she would have earned in February and March in determining her labor force attachment. So you might think it makes sense to go and look back at the preceding quarter from October to December of that should read 2012, I'm sorry, from 2012. However, due to kind of the history of the UI program, we don't look at those wages. Why is that? That's because historically, so in the 1930s and 1940s, it took a long time to process wage data. So employers would have paper copies of a worker's earning records. They would need to transport it to the UIA office, maybe by horse and buggy or by steam engine. And then all of those papers would need to be filed. So it didn't make sense to look at the lag quarter because there wasn't time to get that information together. So instead, we would look back into a quarter preceding the lag quarter, in this worker's case, July through September of 2012. So we are then looking back. So this worker is losing her job on Groundhog's Day, but we're ignoring the wages she had on President's Day, on Thanksgiving, on Halloween, and looking back to her wages on 4th of July and Labor Day and the year preceding that. So that's looking back kind of far. So why would this be a problem for a low-earning worker? The main reason is that low-wage workers tend to have shorter average work tenures than their higher-earning counterparts. What I mean by this is that while someone who earns high wages is more likely to stay at a job for 4 or 5 years, this low-earning worker might be working for 6 months or for 9 months. And so when we exclude their earnings, we might be excluding almost all of their earnings if we're excluding the filing quarter and the lag quarter. In addition, these workers have the most trouble meeting the high quarter wage requirement, which could occur during the lag quarters. And these are the workers who are most likely to be on the margins of monetary eligibility. So every recent week that you exclude may hurt them more than it hurts another worker. So what is the alternative base period? It's actually pretty simple. So we have here the standard base period, and what we do with our alternative base period is we just shift forward the 4 quarters of earnings that we're looking at to include the lag quarter. And when most states implement this policy, they first run the worker's earnings history through the standard base period, and then they run it again through the alternative base period if the worker is ineligible under the standard base period. So this is another advantage for a low-wage worker who might be on the thresholds of monetary eligibility. They kind of have this opportunity to try twice. However, there's another side of the coin. We may think that this is actually not the most helpful intervention. And the reason why is because it's possible that the monetary eligibility criteria are actually not the main barrier to UI receipt among low-wage workers. So let's use the state Montana as an example. This is the state with the median earnings threshold. In Montana, over that 4-quarter period, you have to earn $2,305. A minimum wage worker in Montana who is working 40 hours a week could reach this threshold in 9 weeks. North Carolina is the state with the most stringent requirements, $3,985 in that 4-quarter period. And in that state, a minimum wage worker working full-time could reach the threshold in as little as 4 months. So this means that perhaps this is not the most important thing to be targeting to increase UI receipts. However, as Luke mentioned before, there's a lot of support for the ABP, and it's widely adopted. So research on the ABP that was done prior to Luke's and my study showed that there was some effect of the alternative base period. However, those studies were done with simulations, or they just looked at the experience of one state. So our study is different from these previous studies because we use nationally representative data from all states over a long time period. The kind of logic behind our evaluation is that a wide variety of states with different work bases, with different political orientations, implemented the alternative base period in a wide variety of years. So the idea here is that it's almost as if it's an experiment. The same way that you might do an experiment in science class and see if adding salt to water makes it boil at a different temperature, we're looking to see if adding the alternative base period makes a worker more likely to receive unemployment insurance. We use a variety of statistical techniques to help make this natural experiment even more experiment-like. If you're interested in our methodology, I recommend that you check out our paper, which is on the website of the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. But the more exciting thing is kind of what we ended up finding. What we ended up finding is we looked at the effect of the alternative base period for all workers, and then we separated the workers out by educational level with the idea that less educated workers are more likely to be low wage. And what we found when we separated the workers in this way is no effect, no statistically significant effect of the alternative base period on the probability of unemployment insurance receipt for any group. However, if you think back to my earlier remarks when I was talking about why we thought monetary eligibility might not be a big barrier, I was talking about a full-time worker that would be able to meet these criteria in a pretty short amount of time. So We also know, though, that in today's economy, workers are having more and more trouble accessing a full 40 hours of work per week. Employers are more likely to give workers fewer hours. So we examined the probability of UI receipts among workers with less than a high school degree who were only able to put together part-time hours or chose part-time hours. And there we did find a significant effect of the ABP. We found that the ABP was associated with a 2.8 percentage point increase in the likelihood of receiving unemployment insurance. Well, what does that mean? What it means is that, to give a concrete example, if in 2011 every single state had used the alternative base period, we would see 24,000 more workers receiving unemployment insurance. That would have been the case in 2011 if no states had used the alternative base period. However, we estimate that in 2011 there were 16 million unemployed workers. So that gives kind of a sense of how large that number is in the full context of the economy. So what does this imply? To me, what this suggests is that the alternative base period policy is a good policy that is really helping a specific group of workers, and a group of workers that's growing in importance and size as we're adding more and more service sector jobs to our economy. However, the disparity in unemployment insurance receipt rates for workers affects a much larger group of workers than just part-time workers with less than a high school diploma. So this suggests that we need to do further research to examine other barriers to receiving unemployment insurance, including application and non-monetary eligibility. And the other Alix and Claire will talk more about these issues. And so I will turn it over to them. But before I do that, I'll just say thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And feel free to check out our paper if you have more questions about the study. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alix. My name is Alix Hertel-Fernandez, Alix number 2, and I'm a doctoral student at Harvard. As Luke mentioned, the research that I'll be presenting today has been done jointly with Professor Jeff Wenger of the University of Georgia. So we just heard from Alix number 1 about changes in the formal rules governing UI eligibility to increase take-up. I'm going to focus on a different aspect of improving UI take-up, who actually applies for benefits in the first place. Many of the disparities we observe in UI recipiency actually start with which workers are applying for benefits. And we know from Alix and Luke's past research, for example, that low-educated and minority workers are less likely than highly educated or white workers to report applying for UI benefits. Clearly, then, benefit application is an important moment for state governments and advocates to intervene to improve take-up. And in my presentation, I'm going to be discussing the potential pitfalls that are associated with one policy to improve application, informational interventions, based on research that uses a survey experiment. So a lack of information is one important reason why workers might fail to apply for benefits, but the academic literature suggests several other reasons too. Benefits may be too low for workers to think it worthwhile to apply. The application process may be too onerous or time-consuming for workers, and applying for benefits or receiving benefits may be too highly stigmatized for workers. Jeff and I decided to focus on information and information costs for two sets of reasons. First, information is perhaps the lowest cost and easiest intervention for program administrators and advocates, especially compared to formal legislative changes. Second, we know that information is an especially important barrier for workers in the UI system. We know, again, from Alix and Luke's research, for example, that of the unemployed who didn't apply for benefits, disadvantaged workers were more likely to cite monetary requirements as a reason for thinking they were ineligible. Yet we also know that monetary requirements are generally not the main obstacle for worker eligibility. So these disadvantaged workers may not have a good idea about what the actual program rules are. This suggests that information could potentially improve application rates, particularly for disadvantaged workers. In addition, unemployed workers may have few resources for information about unemployment insurance, and we believe there's reason to think that there are fewer resources available now than there perhaps once were. For example, unions once played an important role in helping blue-collar workers apply for and receive benefits, but are clearly no longer in a position to do this for large chunks of the labor force today. Second, research that I've done suggests that unemployment insurance receives considerably less media attention compared to other major social programs like Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. So workers are less likely to be able to turn to newspapers or TV shows for information about the program. Finally, and this is something that Luke alluded to in his introduction, there's actually a perverse incentive that employers may have a reason not to provide as much information to their workers about unemployment insurance as other social programs because of the way in which unemployment insurance is financed. Every additional claim that's made by a former worker of an employer could potentially raise the tax rate of that in particular employer. So for all of these reasons, I believe that a lack of information is an important barrier to UI application, particularly for disadvantaged workers. With that motivation in mind, Jeff and I sought to examine what the effect of an informational intervention would be on workers' likelihood of applying for benefits. In order to conduct this research, we conducted a survey experiment, and this is a setup where you take a pool of survey participants and divide them randomly into different groups. Some participants receive information while others do not, and then we can compare those groups, and any differences that we observe between those groups are attributable to the information and not any individual characteristics of the participants on average. I won't dwell too long on the logistics of our survey, but I'm more than happy to talk about these in the Q&A or offline. We recruited participants through an Amazon web service that is rapidly becoming the norm in academia, and we restricted our participants in our survey to American full-time prime-age workers who followed our survey instructions. We then divided the participants in our survey into 4 groups. One group of participants didn't receive any information about unemployment insurance. This was our control or our comparison group. And then each of the other 3 groups of participants received information about some aspects of unemployment insurance that was short, concise, and importantly, customized to the respondent's state of employment. So, for example, a worker from Alabama received information in our survey about Alabama's unemployment insurance system and so on. So the 3 types of information that we received, or that participants in our survey received, were clustered in these 3 categories. One group of participants received information about benefit generosity in their state, such as the minimum, the maximum, and the average benefit available to them. They also learned how long benefits were available for. Another group of participants received information about the monetary and non-monetary eligibility requirements in their state. And a final group of participants received information about the procedures for applying for benefits, such as whether or not they could apply by telephone, by online, or if they had to go into an office in person. We also gave workers in this group information about how quickly claimants typically received their benefits after a certain number of weeks. So after giving participants either no information or one of these 3 types of information, we then asked the participants how likely they would be to apply for benefits if they were to become unemployed. We used a 0 to 100 sliding scale, where 0 indicates that the respondent was certain that they would not apply, and 100 indicates that the participant was certain that they would apply for benefits. Now, our expectation going into this research was that workers who got information about the generosity of benefits and the application procedures would be more likely to apply for benefits, while the workers who received information about eligibility requirements would be slightly less likely to apply. What we found, however, generally went completely against our expectations. So these are our main results from the experiment. On average, the workers who received no information about unemployment insurance reported that they would, about a 70% probability that they would apply for benefits should they become unemployed. All of the participants who received information about unemployment insurance, however, whether that information was about eligibility requirements, generosity, or the application procedure, all of these participants were substantially less likely to report applying for unemployment benefits than those who received no information. So simple, concise, and salient information about unemployment insurance thus had a negative effect on the likelihood of people reporting that they would apply for benefits. The negative effects were largest, as you can see, for the workers who received information about the eligibility requirements in their states and the application procedures. What is more, these effects are statistically large, and they're large enough that we can rule out the possibility that they happen just by chance with some degree of confidence. These negative effects are also meaningfully large. They're about the same size as the differences between workers with and without a college degree and between white and non-white workers in their likelihood of applying. To put it another way, giving a college-educated worker information about UI has the same size negative effect as a non-college educated worker has on the probability that they would apply for benefits. So clearly, these negative effects of information are substantial. So the natural question that follows from these findings is why? Why did providing additional information about unemployment insurance dampen our participants' likelihood of applying for benefits? Here we think there are two main possible explanations. First, maybe the information overwhelmed workers or made the process seem daunting. And then second, perhaps workers had the wrong impression of unemployment insurance. In particular, they had a wrong impression of how generous benefits were and how easy it would be to apply for benefits. And our information thus produced a negative shock as workers realized that benefits were actually stingier than they originally thought. Our research so far suggests that the second explanation is at play. Individuals came into our survey with incorrect beliefs and expectations about how the system works, and our intervention produced a backfire effect as workers adjusted their expectations accordingly. So to wrap up, what lessons can we draw from this research for the work done by program activists and program administrators? I think the main lesson to draw is that providing information, even when it is simple, customized, and salient to workers, may not actually improve take-up and may actually reduce take-up. And our research suggests that the information barrier that program activists and administrators need to pay attention to isn't just a lack of knowledge about unemployment insurance, but the fact that many workers may have the wrong knowledge about unemployment insurance, that they have incorrect expectations about how the program works and how you go about applying for benefits. This in turn, I think, implies that state leaders and advocates need to think carefully about how they design information interventions in ways that will not promote a backfire effect. And this will probably involve carefully targeting and customizing information based on different subgroups of workers. And I think finally, this research shows that survey experiments, like the one that we used here, are really an excellent and a low-cost way of evaluating potential interventions to improve take-up before bringing those interventions to scale. So discovering an intervention fails or even backfires in a survey experiment is definitely preferable to making that discovery in an actual scaled-up campaign. Before I hand over the reins to Claire, who's going to present an overview of current state UI policy on the ground, I just want to say that this is all research in progress and that Jeff and I would really appreciate any advice or input that you have if you have any reactions to these initial findings. So don't hesitate to contact me. I look forward to hearing from you and from taking your questions. And now here is Claire to give you an update of UI legislation on the ground now.
Thanks, Alex. So my name is Claire McKenna. I'm a policy analyst at the National Employment Law Project, and I'm based in New York City. In this presentation today, I'll review 4 non-monetary UI policies which support greater access to the program by low and moderate wage workers. But before I do this, though, I do want to briefly just set the context for my recommendation. So Luke had sort of mentioned this. Most people who study the UI program know that states are grappling with insolvency of their trust funds. And we can generally attribute this problem to two factors. The first is a tendency of states in recent decades to stray from forward funding principles. The second factor, of course, is the increased demand for benefits brought on by the Great Recession. So states had to borrow from the federal government at an unprecedented scale to continue paying state benefits over this period. Now they're tasked with paying the money back and are responding in various ways. Unfortunately, many states have favored benefit cuts and eligibility restrictions over addressing longstanding financing deficiencies, as NELP has documented substantially. So Luke and Alix have identified the importance, obviously, of non-monetary rules in determining the eligibility of low-wage workers. Florida specifically is a state dealing with insolvency by making significant benefit cuts, but also by making significant changes to UI policy filing procedures, the latter which we know bears no relation to a worker's employment and earnings history. So as this slide shows, claimants in Florida now must file all claims online and complete a 45-question, essentially academic test known as an initial skills review, among other changes. So the result of these changes is that the process of filing an initial claim is now much more difficult for workers in Florida, especially for low-income workers with literacy or language challenges, and potentially eligible claimants are being discouraged from filing. And once they do file, the program seeks to divert them. So as a result, the number of workers in Florida who received a first payment relative to new applications for regular state benefits was just 39% in 2012 compared to 72% nationally. I mentioned Florida just so listeners can be mindful of the challenges, the challenging political climate in which state UI programs operate. So as I offer recommendations to expand eligibility, keep in mind that legislators in some states are really taking pains to limit the outflow of UI benefits. And to do so, they're turning to these procedural barriers, which fall particularly hard on less advantaged workers. So along with the sort of good policies I'll discuss, advocates for low-income workers should be vigilant of these access barriers. So the first policy to encourage greater low-wage worker access is to permit unrestricted good cause for voluntarily leaving work. So in general, a worker must be unemployed involuntarily to qualify for UI benefits. Otherwise, workers who voluntarily leave a job may qualify if they do so with good cause. So there are two types. The first is good cause for work-related reasons. This includes, for example, sudden changes in the condition of a job, which may breach an earlier agreement. Sexual harassment is another example. The second type, which we should be most concerned with, is personal, essentially reasons relating to common work-family conflicts, like child care availability, illness of a family member. To accept a better job is another example. And I'll just briefly provide an example for clarification. Say that a woman with children working at a department store suddenly finds that her child care arrangement has fallen through. Rather than quickly place her children in more expensive care, she decides it's more cost-effective to quit her job and look after her children herself until she finds a lower-cost arrangement. In some states, she could do just that and still qualify for benefits once she's found that new arrangement. So all but 11 states require that good cause for voluntarily quitting be connected to work, though many make individual exceptions for personal reasons. So in 2009, as has been mentioned earlier, the Recovery Act incentivized states to permit voluntary quits for what are known as compelling family reasons, and in all 19 states expanded coverage to varying degrees. The most progressive programs permit the broadest definition of good cause and account for the diverse set of reasons which force reasonable people to leave a job, particularly workers with limited means. The Recovery Act enhancements represent a favorable but intermediate approach to this issue. That said, states should be encouraged to continue adopting all possible exceptions to laws restricting good cause to work-related reasons. However, the broadest approach would be to repeal such provisions which require that good cause be attributable to work. And I've provided here a link to a model policy in California. So the second recommendation is to establish parity for part-time workers. So just as quick background, UI claimants must look and be available for work to maintain eligibility. Usually this work must be similar to the claimant's base period at work. Unfortunately, many states require part-time workers to seek full-time work, even if most of their base period employment is part-time. So such a recommendation is justified, I think, by the growth in non-standard schedules and the conditions of the post-recession U.S. economy. So I will just skip over this slide quickly. I think people are aware generally of these conditions. I'm just conscious of time. So the Recovery Act also incentivized states to permit part-time availability for certain workers, usually workers with a history of part-time work. And while it wasn't required, states could also permit availability for part-time work for claimants with a full-time work history. So this table is a summary of the way state UI programs treat part-time workers. I'll have you look at the first left-hand column, which shows that 33 states permit workers to look for part-time work as long as they demonstrate a history of part-time work. 6 states do so only if the claimant has a medical issue or some other reason restricting availability. So those states are shown in bold in the middle column. And we estimate that still 13 states require claimants to look for full-time work, and this is shown in the right-hand column of the table. Ideally, all states would be in the most left-hand column. At the very least, they could make exceptions for medical issues or other good cause reasons. But the more progressive programs protect workers with non-standard schedules and exhibit flexibility during weak recovery periods, like the one that we're very much in now. So a third UI policy advocates concerned with low-wage worker access should understand is providing fairer treatment for workers who take temporary jobs. So for most workers who are laid off for lack of work, they qualify for benefits as long as they earned enough wages and seek and are available for new work. However, more than half of states make a really problematic exception for workers in the temp industry by requiring that they report to the agency which laid them off for a new assignment. And if they don't, they're deemed to have voluntarily quit without good cause and could be disqualified. So this provision obviously creates a double standard for unemployed workers who accept work with a temp firm for a fixed duration. So once that worker completes his assignment, he has to report back to the agency, even if he would rather search for more stable permanent work. And by contrast, a claimant who takes a job directly with a manufacturing firm, for example, and is laid off a few months later, can simply reactivate his claim and continue receiving benefits. So in reality, this policy serves more to prevent the temp industry from bearing UI charges than to reconnect workers to future employment, since if the temp agency can place the worker in another assignment, their experience-rated UI tax won't be affected. So currently, 31 states deem a failure to contact the temp employer a voluntary quit without good cause. And this actually most recently includes the state of Wisconsin, which passed such a provision as part of its budget. And a bill pending in Massachusetts, fortunately, repeals that state's existing provision. So a fair and responsible UI programs encourage workers to consider as many employment options as possible, and they don't penalize them for this effort. They seek to reconnect claimants to steady, decent employment rather than relegating them to a cycle of short-term dead-end work. So the final policy recommendation I'll review is to permit late filing of initial claims if good cause is shown. So as background, workers are advised to file their first application for UI as soon as possible after they become separated from a job. Generally, claims filed 14 to 21 days after the week for which the claimant is requesting benefits are considered latent states. And this is an important issue, as has been mentioned earlier, since a key driver of UI recipiency in states is the rate at which workers apply for benefits in the first place. And research from my co-presenters shows that low-educated and minority workers are less likely to apply. And the reasons for this non-application may be lack of access to a reliable information source, low literacy, and other reasons which have been discussed before. So, these laws were written back when workers had to file in person and contemplated issues like hurricanes and other emergencies, but state UI programs seeking to provide greater coverage to low-income workers specifically should really account for the unique circumstances this group faces both at work and personally, which may prevent them from not filing in a timely manner. And by unique circumstances, I'm referring to the possibility of an unscrupulous employer, for example, who might coerce a worker into not filing or misrepresent his eligibility. This also includes compelling reasons like illness or various caregiving commitments. And I'm also referring to just honest error, since we're talking about workers who may have limited English capability or experience with computers and the internet. So Connecticut has in their regulations a concept known as good faith error, which basically refers to small, honest mistakes by first-time claimants. And in the increasingly automated claim filing world in which workers are being asked to jump through various hoops, as in Florida, states should be forgiving of instances in which a claimant obviously got held up by some technical issue. I linked to Florida here too, which I think is broad and fairly explicit in what it considers good cause for late filing. So since I had sort of a short amount of time, we all could spend more time talking about this, we would. I provided links to various resources here from NELP and from the Department of Labor that everyone should feel free to explore if they want to explore these topics further. And my email address is at the beginning of this presentation. So thank you very much. I'll just turn it over now to Luke for the Q&A portion.
Thanks, Claire. Claire, I'm going to start with you with a question. You mentioned just at the beginning that a lot of states have found themselves in major financial stress with the program, and so that this has sort of moved a lot of them to try to focus on reducing the roles through benefits and eligibility. What was the cause of the mess? How did they end up in such bad financial straits? Was it just a matter of the Great Recession being so long and hard, or were there other factors at play?
I mean, I think, there are people who have studied UI financing and solvency and could probably talk at a greater length than I could necessarily about with this. But as I mentioned, states abandoned what is known as forward funding, and that really entails building up reserves through higher payroll taxes when the economy is strong so that benefits can be paid to workers when it sours. And I'll take my experience. New York State just reformed its unemployment insurance program this year, and I think it's probably a good example of what's happening in a lot of states. So the taxable wage base in New York has been held at $8,500 since the late 1990s. And as wages grew, this key funding mechanism stayed flat. And I think the tax rates in the state as well, which vary according to the number of people an employer lays off, have also been kept low. So most states, or many states, entered the recession not appropriately funding their programs, and of course, then once the shock of the recession hit, they were sort of screwed. So, so that's essentially what I think was the problem. So,
thanks, Alex. Number two, I wanted to ask you. Your results might make those of us who think people just need more information about UI to apply fret. And so the question is there a way to get around this? Do you have any hope for informational interventions, or is it just a matter of the fact that, as one of the questions that came up on your screen asked, are benefits just too low to make it worth it for everyone?
Thanks for the question. I answered the question that came in offline, and I said, absolutely. I think that benefit generosity is a big determinant of application rates and take-ups, and I forwarded some studies that do show that in states where benefits are more generous, you do see higher take-up rates. So that's clearly an important part of it. But in this climate that Claire just described of, fiscal pressure, I think, raising benefits might be a harder sell than doing some interventional work with information. And I haven't lost all hope with the research that I've been doing. I think that if you design interventions in carefully targeted ways that show just how important these benefits could be to workers and their families for their financial security, and really highlight the potential worth of those benefits, that you could see some improvement in take-up. And so that's the next step of the project, is to see if we can move the dial in the other direction.
Great. Alex, number one, we had a question that came in. I've come across several folks who did not want to apply until they really needed the money, and they often waited several months until their savings were exhausted before applying. Based on your monthly labor review paper, as well as our JPAM paper, as well as your qualitative dissertation, if you have any sort of musings at the front end as you start that analysis, do you have any sense of how people think about the application process and why they might be so reluctant to apply until they really need it?
Yeah. So I think so far, Luke mentioned my dissertation research, which is a qualitative study where I'm interviewing a variety of people who lost their jobs and seeing what their process of applying was. And I have talked to people in similar situations who kind of assumed that they would be reemployed or didn't feel like they needed to apply right away and waited in the same way that you have observed. And I think, there's two implications of this phenomenon. One is, so to backtrack, if your clients are waiting 2 to 3 months to apply and exhausting their savings and then applying, what will happen for them is that when the state looks at them using the standard base period, that will be what the alternative base period would have been. So they've waited long enough that they're in a new filing quarter, and so that lag quarter will be included in looking at their earnings history, because unemployment benefits are calculated based on when you apply and not when your job ends. So this could be a problem for someone who waits a very long time. I talked to one woman who had waited 6 months or 7 months because of depression related to the job loss. And then once she kind of got her act together, she felt that she would no longer monetarily qualify. Now, I think she may have monetarily qualified, so I think it's a good idea to encourage people to apply, even if it's late. And then I think it's also a good idea when we're talking to people to just really encourage them to apply as soon as possible, regardless of what they anticipate the future being like, just as kind of a safety mechanism. And then I think the final implication is it's interesting to think about, would there be a way to calculate labor force attachment based on the day someone loses their job rather than the day that someone files? And would that way make more sense, and would that way be feasible?
Great. Claire, I'm going to send the last question over to you, and I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions that come up after the webinar ends, and I think if you'd like to direct those to the SSRC folks, we will, the panelists will continue to answer questions via the website after the webinar is over. Claire, a legal aid expert from Minnesota, was wondering what can be done about denials due to misconduct. Misconduct used to be defined as very serious violations or negligence in the workplace. It now seems to have evolved into simple poor performance measures and oftentimes just attitude. So are you familiar with any trend in this, and any insights into the background on it and what we might do about it?
Unfortunately, this isn't an area that I'll be able to speak on extensively. I think the one thing, though, but I'm happy to, of course, refer this question to one of my colleagues, but I think the one thing that I have observed is that states have been looking to define misconduct as have been sort of capturing behavior, seeking to capture behavior that occurs outside of the workplace and outside of working hours, and to sort of bring that under, the umbrella of misconduct. So it's not only how a worker has behaved while at work, but again, I have seen states looking at outside of the workplace and working hours. So, which I believe Florida actually has done this, but I'm not certain. So,
sure.
But it's a good question.
Well, since we have one last minute, I put my cards on the table with my magic wand. I'm going to ask each of the panelists in one sentence or less if you could wave your magic wand and change one thing about UI, what would it be? And since I've written with Alix Gould-Werth, I'm going to make her be the first one to answer.
I would get rid of experience rating for employers so that they wouldn't have an incentive to contest claims of applicants. Is that a good answer?
Good answer. Alix, number 2?
In addition to seconding that, the elimination of experience rating, I would say a simple suggestion might be to mail a welcome letter to all workers once they start working that tells them about unemployment insurance and how long they'll have to work to become qualified for benefits, and then how they go about applying should they become unemployed, to raise awareness about the program.
Claire?
I agree with Alix, number 2, and I guess stronger federal standards. Specifically, I mean, we've seen states sort of attack pieces, I shouldn't use the word attack, but have been seeking to cut areas of the program that were once deemed sacred, like the 26-week durational standard. So.
Well, amazingly, and especially with such an arcane topic, I think we have a near consensus on what should be done to UI next. So I'm sure our 3 panelists will, in a very short order, have these reforms in place in the system, and we'll be back for a webinar to assess the effects of them sometime soon. So thank you very much to everyone, and please tune into future SSRC webinars as well. Thank you.